Hello again, friends. Today we're going to wrap up the vintage tier list. We're going to have tier 4 decks and bottom tier decks this time. Tier 4 decks are decks that are not great, definitely worse than the tier 3 and tier 3.5 decks that have some actual potential. Right now they're either missing core facets of the deck that would keep them from being good, they have rainbow triggers that really hold them back, or they otherwise have some other core problems that just make it so that this isn't even the deck that you would consider running if you were trying to play optimally. So we're going to start off with Amon Dark Irregulars. Amon with any other boss right now has several major weaknesses. The biggest major weakness is that the only cards that soul charge more than one card would be Decadent Succubus, which you can't have with an Amon Vanguard. You would have Dark Soul Conductor, which does not soul charge during your turn, so then you don't get the power boost until the next turn for Amon, and you can't get the power boost at all for Doreen. And then Hysteric Shirley, which is still a great card, but Hysteric Shirley is like the only card that gives you that double soul charge during the main phase while you have an Amon Vanguard. And we only have, really, Alluring Succubus as a grade 1 soul charger. So we're pretty severely crippled in terms of how we make power rows with Doreen. In addition to that, we're forced to run stand triggers. However, Dark Irregulars don't really like stand triggers. They want to be able to make big rows with the opponent at 5 damage, and they need those crits to get them to 5 damage in the first place so that those big rows can finish off the opponent. And the only way to benefit from stand triggers with Dark Irregulars right now, other than having perhaps a grade 2 Amon, would be to have a Doreen in the front row. But if you're in a matchup where your opponent can't hit back row, having Doreen in the front row is just way too great of a risk. So that's not really going to help you out a whole lot. Plus, you need to have Doreen soul charge 4 times, and how in the heck are you doing that? So there's really no effective way to make use of Dark Irregulars as a monoclan with Amon in this particular format. Once we get another critical trigger and Dimension Creeper and Flirtatious Succubus, all of those will be coming with sets 6 through 9. Dark Irregulars are going to be in a much better spot for Amon specifically. We'll even get Basilisk as a rearguard option that hits 12k. So Doreen with a single soul charge will be 21k with that, or grade 1 Amon with that will be 21k. And that'll put Dark Irregulars in a much more solid overall spot. Right now, they are not doing super hot. Next up, we have grade 3 Kagero. So this is your Dragonic Waterfall, your Goku, your Volblade. They all have effects that allow you to either discard excess grade 3s for ridiculous power, or they get bonus power when you drive check grade 3s, or they retire back row when you drive check grade 3s. That's all very nice, and there's a lot of consistency with the deck. The deck functions very well, so you're not typically getting grade locked with it because you're using the Amber Dragon Ride Chain, and you always are going to be checking those grade 3s, so you're always going to be getting those positive benefits with the deck, and that's all great. Of course, the downside is you have a bajillion cards that have no shield value, and even with 4 Sentinels in your deck, that's not going to be enough to keep you safe, and you're also going to be limited on how much back row you have access to. So the deck has a lot of weaknesses. It's not very good, but it is very fun. So if you're looking for a fun deck to play, I recommend grade 3 Kagero. If you're looking for a good deck to play, I'm sorry, this one's not it. Next up, we have Flare Whip Dragon. Flare Whip Dragon is 2 cards away from being viable, maybe even tier 2. And that is incredibly tragic. So Flare Whip Dragon's effect is when it drive checks a Kagero Flame Dragon, it gets 3000 power. Now, this allows you to use that effect to break through 2-to-passes very easily because it's going to break through a 1-to-pass with its own effect because you're going to be drive checking predominantly Flame Dragons because you're playing a Flame Dragon deck. So what's the problem? The problem is that the 2 cards that we're missing are Flame Dragon triggers. And that is absolutely awful for this deck because if you drive check and your opponent, let's say that you're 10k, or let's say you're 18k with a boost, and your opponent is sitting at cross-ride defense, and they drop 15k shield. So you need 10,000 power to break through. So if you drove check a single trigger, that should be enough to get you through. And let's say you drive check, you get a grade 3 Kagero Flame Dragon. Okay, so now you're up to 21k. And then all you need is a Flame Dragon trigger, and then boom, you're going to break through it. Well, you drive check a trigger, and it's only a 50-50 shot that that trigger is a Flame Dragon, and because that's the case, that means that you have a 50-50 shot, even if you check that trigger, that you're not going to be able to break through that 2-to-pass. And that is a major issue. If it was the case that we were missing, say, grade 3s, grade 2s, grade 1s, it would not have been so big of an issue that we were missing some flame dragons. But because it is specifically triggers, that's what the real issue is. So there's no real way to mitigate the fact that that is an incredible weakness of this deck, and it kind of defeats the entire purpose of getting that 8,000 power when you drive check the flame dragon trigger. And that's what you're really wanting with this deck. So because that's a weakness, that's why it's so far down in the tier list. Next up, we have set 1 Alfred. Now, Alfred as a card can be played in MLB. It can be played in Soul Saver. It can be played in Galahad. There's a bunch of different ways that you can tech Alfred in the decks. I think generally speaking, that's always the wrong choice because Alfred is a garbage card. The ability to not be boosted sucks. The ability to get bonus power and attack as if you were boosted just makes it a net even. There's no real benefit or disadvantage to it. And then finally, Counterblast 3 to get a card from your deck, a single card. That is so lackluster. So combining all of these effects into one card, this card is incredibly lackluster. Like, I don't see why you would ever want any of these 3 skills, and you'd be better off just running Star Drive Dragon. Oh wait, that's not an option. So because that's the case, I don't think Alfred does anything for any given deck, and the only reason why it's as high as it is because even set 1 Royal Paladins had the advantage of having some pretty strong rear guards. Now, I will say, you can put Alfred into a better deck, and that deck will be higher than tier 4. For example, if you're playing Alfred Soul Saver, and instead of running Lohengrins, you're running Alfreds, that deck will still be pretty strong. It'll be weaker, it won't be tier 1, but it'll still be pretty strong. And because that's the case, then you have to factor in, well, do I evaluate the card Alfred bad, or do I evaluate the Alfred deck bad? And overall, I'm just putting this in tier 4 just because I think that's the most fair place to put this. Any deck that runs Alfred would almost certainly be better if it didn't run Alfred outside of Invincible Alfred. And I'm very convinced that that is the case. Alfred is just not a particularly good card in this format. Next up, we have Maiden of Trailing Rose. Maiden of Trailing Rose is actually not a bad card. 11k defense, Persona Blast, the ability to check top 5, call 2. That's great. That is actually very, very good. The downside is that, unlike Mandala Lord, I don't believe that Neonectar's got the top 5 searches. I'm pretty sure they didn't. And even if they did, that's still an 8k unit that's searching top 5 to get another copy of this, and that's not fantastic. And you need to have bigger units to call so that you get more total effect from the plussing. So Corolla Dragons would be good. Heyo Pineapples would be good. They make 19k together. Laurel would be good since she's a 12k attacker as a grade 3. There are good cards that you can call from this, but ultimately the rainbow triggers are really dragging it down. And outside of the vanillas and the beaters, there's really not a whole lot that Neonectar has going on for its rearguard selection at this point in time, and that's kind of what drags the deck down. Next up, we have Mandala Lord. Mandala Lord does for sure have the on-hit check top 5 grade 2, that's 8k. Not very useful, but it is what it is. Mandala Lord itself is actually not a terrible card. Obviously, when we get Shirayuki later, Shirayuki is just Mandala Lord plus 2. But Mandala Lord itself is Counterblast 1, get rid of an extra copy of himself to basically get the effect of a 10k shield. And being able to leverage grade 3s as defensive tools is very useful. I'm not going to pretend that it's not. Of course, Shirayuki did it much better, and this card overall just wasn't as strong. That being said, he's not terrible either, so I'm going to leave him at tier 4. He has the same weaknesses that Neonectar has with rainbow triggers. I will say that there are some pretty decent rear guards that Murakumo has access to, like Voidelga, which is the grade 3 9k, where when you call it, you can counterblast 1 to call another copy of it, and then at the end of turn, one of them goes to your hand, I think, and the other one goes to the bottom of your deck. You do that on your grade 2 turn, and then you can just play it again like normal next turn, and then do it again. That lets you get a pretty effective rush out without your opponent having anything to swing into, and that also forces them to swing into your Vanguard, give you damage, give you resources, and it makes it so that your defensive triggers can also shut them down far more aptly than they otherwise would have. But that's not good enough to make the deck, viable or anything. Next up, we have Invincible Amon. You might be wondering, what is Invincible Amon? What does that even do? Well, the goal of this deck is to get early soul using the Dark Irregulars engine, whether that be Decadent Succubus, Hysteric Shirley, or what have you. And then you sit on a Dark Irregulars Vanguard, and then you have 8 soul and 5 counterblasts available. So you attack with your Vanguard, Generally speaking, it's going to be an Amon. And then you get your drive checks, and then you attack into a rear guard with Mr. Invincible. Mr. Invincible's Mega Blast procs, and you get to stand all of your units. And when you do, then you get to attack with Amon again, and you get more drive checks. And it's just a huge freaking push turn. Obviously, that's not reliable, that's not consistent, and your opponent has more control over you being at 5 damage than you do. But it's a fun deck. And last, rounding out the bottom of tier 4, right before we get into the trash tier, we have Scarlet Witch Coco. Now, Coco itself is an absolutely cracked card. Once we get Lulu in set 7, Coco is going to be elevated directly to tier 1. It is going to be stronger than Tsukuyomi, I would argue. Maybe stronger than MLB and Dote, even. Drawing 3 cards when you ride to grade 3 for Counterblast 2 is insane. Drawing another 2 cards when you ride over the grade 3 with the next grade 3 is also insane. And you have the ability to still use cards like Coco to trigger Scry. So this deck can still do things that it needs to do in order to win. And overall, it's a very incredibly powerful card. But for right now, we don't have a starter that works with it. So Lozenge Magus takes 1 soul away, which sounds good in theory, but then you don't have a way to remove the soul in order to be able to get the effect now if you remove the soul away with Lozenge Magus. And then if you ride the Tsukuyomi Ride Chain, you can't ride to grade 2, otherwise you have way too much soul to possibly Soul Blast out with Psychic Bird, and if you don't have the ability to Soul Blast that soul with Psychic Bird, Coco will never get to draw. So the fact that you need Psychic Bird, and you need to have Coco, and you need to have a specific setup where you only get the grade 1 Tsukuyomi and never see the grade 2 Tsukuyomi, and the fact that there's no other Forerunners, no other starters that you can even run to try and make this deck work, it's just an absolutely garbage deck. And that's why it's rounding out the bottom of tier 4. And continuing on, we have the bottom tier. These are decks that have extraordinarily broad weaknesses, or they're missing necessary pieces in order for their decks to function. To start off with, we have Top Gun. Top Gun as a card gets bonus power whenever one of your Nova Grappler rear guards becomes rested. It has anti-synergy with every single type of trigger. So if you hit a draw, crit, or heal, you can pass those over to your rear guard, but then you won't get the bonus power from that rear guard resting. If you hit a stand trigger, the bonus power from your rear guard resting from the stand trigger will not apply to Top Gun in time for him to hit. And all in all, that makes him pretty weak. You could say that this card is just like Cup Bowler, but Cup Bowler has the advantage of being able to be a restander, and him being a restander gives him that advantage where he's able to swing multiple times, and that bonus power gets to continue to be utilized, and him attacking last is nowhere near as punished as Top Gun attacking last. So obviously Top Gun, not a particularly good card. Next up, we have grade 3 Royal Paladins. So Barkle allows you to run only 2 grade 2s and still ride up with the same level of consistency, actually greater consistency than a normal deck otherwise would have the ability to run. And this is actually pretty interesting and pretty fun, but you have other complicated downsides like not having enough shield value, and most pressingly, Royal Paladins don't have any good grade 3 synergistic cards. Currently, the only one that we have is Butterfly Dagger Bridget, which is the same effect as Volblade. Whenever you drive check a grade 3 Royal Paladin, it gets 5,000 power. But that's not enough. That's not sufficient to want to run a 17 grade 3 Royal Paladin deck. Not to say that it would be entirely awful, because you would still have Soul Saver Dragon, and Soul Saver would already have the Soul setup, but it's definitely not better than the tier 1 deck of Barkle Soul Saver, so clearly that deck has a lot of problems. Next up, we have Fang of Light Garmor. Garmor as a deck thinning mechanism isn't that bad, but the fact that the Brugals that you can summon are the Snowgalls, they're not very good. In order to have more power than a vanilla, you have to have a full board of Snowgalls. And then you only have 9k Snowgalls. And those 9k Snowgalls are, one of them's forced to be an 18k row, and the other 2 are going to be boosting. This is only going to be, well, let's see, that'd be +4, so 14 + 9, 23. I guess that makes a magic number against Crossrides on your Vanguard row. But if you're up against Crossrides, then you're probably up against Dote. If you're up against Dote, they're retiring your Snowgalls. And if they're retiring your Snowgalls, then your deck isn't doing anything. If you're not up against Dragonic Overlord at the end, you still have to have a Snowgall in the front row, which is still vulnerable to attack. overall, like, this deck just isn't doing a whole lot that you need it to be doing. And the fact that you have to discard a hand in order to summon a very weak grade 1 from your deck, also not that great. That being said, this does actually have some marginal benefit against Dragonic Overlord at the end, because one of the big problems that you have against that deck is that you have to consistently have to deal with your back row being sniped, and this can actually compensate for the back row being taken out by continuing to get out more and more back row units, although you're still expending hand cards for it. But overall, the deck just doesn't have any particular advantage that would make you want to run it, and the entire engine itself is really bad, even when it's playing at peak performance. So it's very difficult to recommend running Garmor in this format. Next up, we have Seal Dragon Blockade. This is one of many Kagero grade 3s that just aren't great. All its effect does is it just stops your opponent from intercepting, and that really doesn't do a whole lot in any format, much less this one. So it being basically just a 10k vanilla, it's not that much stronger than Crested Dragon. Obviously, when we get Blockade Inferno, that card is nuts. And set 11 Seal Dragons have a lot of really good cards, but that's not the case here, so it's not the best thing in the world. Next up, we have Amber Dragon Eclipse. So, hilariously, of the 5 set 4 ride chains, all of them either have a ridiculously busted effect with Stern Blaukluger, or the other 3 decks have incredibly strong rear guards. So Storm has Miracle Beauty and Laurel. Miracle Beauty giving you the ability to stand the booster when it stands, and Laurel letting you rest 4 rear guards in order to stand your Vanguard. So those combination of rear guards are very good. PBD and Giraffe, being the same deck, they both have their Violent Vesper clones, so the 9k, reveal the top card of your deck superior, call it. Kagero just doesn't have a good grade 3 backup that it can utilize with this particular card, and that makes it overall just supremely weak. There aren't a whole lot of options that you can use to try and make this deck list better, and there's not even really a good backup ride that synergizes with it. So what I find myself using the Amber Dragon Ride Chain for is typically the higher grade 3 Royal Paladin decks, and not so much for the actual boss of the deck itself. And out of all of the possible effects, this one is the most caca-poo-poo out of all of the freaking effects. Like, Counterblast 2 ahead of time to get the on-hit skill to retire 2 of your opponent's rear guards. That is so garbage. And speaking of garbage, next up we have Gigarex. And I should note, these are not in any order, because if they were, Gigarex would be way lower. Gigarex is whenever one of your Tachikaze is retired, then he gets 1000 power until end of turn. Now, this applies to calling over your units too. So you could, if you had the Counterblast, call Beam Tarot Skype Tarot or a Dragon Egg, and then just call the Beam Tarot over the Dragon Egg, and then the Dragon Egg over the Beam Tarot, Counterblast a bunch, and then this could get 4,000 or 5,000 power. But Counterblast 1 for +1 power is abysmal. And the fact that there is no the fact that there's no battle phase retirement in Tachikaze outside of the next card, that's just like the biggest travesty to Tachikaze as a deck. Like, if they had any type of mid-battle phase retirement, it would have been so much stronger, and the deck would have had actual potential, but now it doesn't. And Gigarex just has to sit here and flounder with one of the most useless effects in all of Vanguard. Next up is Tyrant Deathrex, which is a much better boss. He gets the bonus power of 5,000 ahead of time, and if he hits, you get to retire a unit, but you only need to retire 1. The fact that I don't know how they got Gigarex out of like research and development, because this card does what Gigarex does, only you don't need to wait for the retirement, and the retirement itself is at a more beneficial timing, and it actually has retirement. Like, Gigarex was just so freaking garbage, holy crap. But Deathrex isn't a terrible card, but the fact that your opponent is in control of whether or not it procs means that, especially later in the game, you're not really going to be able to choose to have it sacrifice one of your rear guards and then search your deck for another copy of a different rear guard and get that out and potentially get a multi-attack in. And because that's the case, Deathrex ends up not being very good either. And that's just where Tachikaze is at, because they just don't have, like, whether they really needed something like what Shadow Paladins got, an 8K that was retire a Shadow Paladin rearguard, then it swung for 12. If they had gotten that as a generic card, they would have been in so much better shape. But they didn't, so here we are. Next up is Imperial Daughter. Imperial Daughter is an 11K vanilla, basically all of the time, only you have to counterblast one and eat a card in order for it to not be unable to attack. Alternatively, if you have no other rear guards out, then Imperial Daughter gets plus 10k in a crit and loses its restraint for free. So you can play this with perhaps Juggernaut Maximums or Brackies. It doesn't work. It's not good. And then you want to run crits in order to actually be able to kill your opponent, but all your opponent has to do is just guard one realistic attack, and then they don't have anything else that they have to worry about because it's not like you can pass the triggers to anything. So of course this deck is supremely awful. Next up we have Cosmo Lord. Cosmo Lord actually isn't that garbage of a card, but he's not going to be good until Infinite Phantom Legion. We only have one card that's a 6k Counterblast 1 stand-it, and giving all of that power to just your Vanguard row isn't good yet. But I will say, again, with Infinite Phantom Legion, Cosmo Lord is going to be in a much better spot. That being said, for right now, there's just nothing to really make this work, and you don't really want to just stack all of the power into your Vanguard row anyway. Next up, we have Perfect Riser. Perfect Riser as a card isn't actually bad. It just is missing enough risers to be viable. When we get more support, we're going to get Trans Riser, Burst Riser, and Turbo Riser, and that'll give us an increase from 16 risers in deck to 28 risers in deck. So over half of our deck will be risers. I don't know if we'll get... I'm not sure if we'll have minimum riser yet at that point. If we do, then there's another one, 32. And that will make this a whole lot easier to get off. It's still not great having to suck in 2 extra rear guards on average in order to hit the effect and have the bonus critical. However, having a permanent like 24 2 crit swing from your Vanguard every single turn is amazing. So I'm not going to pretend like that's not great, or maybe it'd be 23k. Well, same difference. 23k 2 crit. So I'm not going to pretend like that's not great when it happens, but right now there just are nowhere near enough risers for this to be consistent, and that's what it's lacking, and that's why it's in the bottom tier. Next up, we have Still Vampire. You can actually do 2 different Still Vampire decks. So one is to just run another Mega Blaster, so no Light King Death Anchor or Demon Eater, and the other would be to run Barkle, and then have a Mr. Invincible Vanguard, and then once you ride Mr. Invincible, he'll Soul Charge, you'll have 6 in Soul, and that will also unflip what you flipped for using Barkle in the first place. And then Still Vampire will be ready to be live after 2 more Soul Charges, which are pretty trivial to gain access to. That deck sucks. Getting Still Vampire's effect off sucks. While we do have the guard restrict and it still does all of the cool neat things it does, your opponent has to be at Death's Door in order for that to matter, and they're not going to be at Death's Door. Next up, we have No Life King Death Anchor. Counterblast 5 in order to get 10k and a crit. Not great. It being a 13k attacker and an 11k defense wall, that's not bad, but it's just not good enough to really do anything more than what Amon would be doing, or to do anything other than what Beelzebub would be doing, which Beelzebub is doing this times 2. So Beelzebub is already a better unit. Actually, it's doing this times 3 because Beelzebub also gets the plus 1000 power for 8 in Soul. So yeah, Beelzebub is just the better No Life King Death Anchor. Next up, we have Mistress Hurricane. Counterblast 2, ouch. Call a Pale Moon from Soul, ouch. So the effect to Call a Pale Moon from Soul on Ride is not supremely great. That's not when we want to be getting our superior calls. And in addition to that, Counterblast 2 is an awful cost to pay. And then needing 8 Pale Moon and Soul in order to get the bonus defense is awful, because the only way that you're ever doing that is if you get the grade 2 out that lets you Soul Charge when you play a Pale Moon rearguard. And this ends up being just the worst overall boss for Pale Moon. And it's not even a particularly close contest. Every other Pale Moon boss just outshines this, and it's not close. Next up, we have Avatar of the Plains Behemoth. This is a clone of Lion Heat. Lion Heat was already bad. This is in a deck that doesn't have any good... Well, I guess technically Behemoth does have better 11 and 12k attackers because they have Laurel, and they have Heyo Pineapple. Whereas Nova Grapplers have Jack, Kung Fu Kid Bolta, and Asura Kaiser. Although you'd have to specifically choose to play Asura Kaiser as a rearguard instead of riding it, and then you'd have to specifically be trying to use Lion Heat as your Vanguard, so that's already a questionable decision. That being said, Behemoth, because of the trigger lineup, is already missing everything it needs in order to be able to be viable. So this is just not going to be cutting it. Karama Lord is a clone of Mr. Invincible. If you didn't know this card existed, I'm not surprised. So it has the exact same skill. Everything about it is identical to Mr. Invincible. The only reason why you want to run this over Mr. Invincible is if you wanted to specifically have the unflip in a Murakumo monoclan deck. However, Murakumo in this particular format has a bunch of cheap pluses, temporary pluses, and those cheap pluses don't need any type of supplemental damage unflip, and they don't really need soul either. So this card ends up being just kind of a wasted spot. It's not terrible, because Mr. Invincible isn't terrible, but it doesn't really offer anything better than what Mr. Invincible does. And Mr. Invincible, as an engine, brings actual trigger lineups, and it brings other unflippers to the table, so there's no real reason to want to run Karama Lord. And ending everything else off, we have Zanbaku. Zanbaku is basically just a vanilla 11k. The only time that you want to ride extra grade 3s in this format would either be a Soul Saver play, potentially wanting to Soul Fix with Barking Manticore, a Cross Ride, and outside of that, there's really not a whole lot else that you would need to ride another grade 3 for. Maybe a Perfect Riser. Because of that, the discard effect is very rarely going to be relevant, and I don't know that it's worth it to play Zanbaku as an 11k vanilla when Mandala Lord exists and is arguably better. So I'm just not seeing it. And because this doesn't have the same effect that it has in V, where you also get to force rest your opponent's Vanguard if you have left and right arrestor, then that also means that it doesn't have the ability to make that locking down of your opponent riding from hand have a more meaningful effect. And in addition to that, I mean, the support cards that it got left and right arrestor are awful. So there's really not a whole lot going on for Zanbaku at this particular stage of the game, and there really won't be until V. Anyway, that's it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. Have a good one.